I'm here with the 3rd edition of the Genki textbook, and I'm dying to find out if it's better than the original. So let's open it up and find out together. So my first impression of the new book is that it's made out of cheaper material, but with that said, the pages are much easier to read. They're whiter, maybe a little bit better paper, I'm not sure. The original was sort of browned, and I wasn't a big fan of that. The cover is a little bit more flimsy, but I don't think anyone's too worried about that. The design is also, I don't know, it looks older. It doesn't look as modern as the original, but that's a personal preference, I imagine. So let's go ahead and see the differences inside. So the first thing I noticed is that in Genki 1, the inside is generally in black and white in the 2nd edition, while as in the 3rd edition, it's usually in a red black and white, or an orange black and white, I suppose. The introduction itself seems to be better written. There's more examples, and it just seems to be a little bit easier to follow, even though a lot of the information is the same. There's also an introduction of the characters right at the beginning, which we do not have in Book 2. Moving into the first introduction lesson, we see that a lot of the pictures are exactly the same, but they're laid out in a little bit more pleasing way to the eye, but they're all pretty much exactly the same, the pictures, the dialogue, everything. It's nice to have the vocabulary over here on the next page. It just seems to be a cleaner setup. Also, you'll notice that while the content is mostly the same, it's been moved around just to be a little bit more clean. The feeling I've gotten from this book so far is that they've just tried to clean up not only the design, but a lot of the language as well, which we'll see a little bit later. You'll notice that some of the practice questions are pushed over onto the next page in this book, and we have one less, so there's less exercises, but there's also class activities, which is really nice for teachers and for if you're doing group learning. They've also introduced numbers in the first introduction as opposed to later in lesson 1. Moving on to lesson 1, it's the same exact title, I think the same exact characters, but you will notice that the dialogue is different. In the first book, our first set of dialogue is Sumimasen, ima nanji desu ka? 12時半です。ありがとうございます。いいえ。Then in the new book we have こんにちは、木村武史です。メリーハートです。留学生ですか？いいえ、日本人です。そうですか。何年生ですか？4年生です。So you can see already that we're going into a lot more detail in the dialogues, and there's just more of it, and I personally think it's quite a bit better than in the original. Moving on, we have a lot of the same vocabulary. It's organized in a better way. In the original, we had just the basic vocabulary, then we had countries, majors, occupations, family. We still have countries, majors, occupations, and on this page we have family, but the original vocabulary is also organized. We have school words, person words, time words, others, and it's just organized in a way so that it's easier to figure out where you should focus and learn. So I'm a big fan of that. I like it. If we go right on to the first page in the first lesson, we'll notice that the language is simplified. It's cutting out a lot of unnecessary, wordy things that were in the original Genki that actually made it much more confusing than it needed to be. While a lot of the example sentences are the same, though some of them are reorganized. So for example, we have shorter sentences here. 学生です。日本語です。12時半です. In this one, the longer sentence was first, which I think is kind of a smart decision to make. You'll also notice we generally have more sentences, or at least they're grouped into one area as opposed to being spread out among paragraphs trying to explain what they mean. So the next thing I noticed is that the sections are all exactly the same. We've got, if you go back to page 1, we've got X wa Y desu, section 1, X wa Y desu, question sentences, noun, no noun, number 3, noun, no noun, and that's the end of chapter 1. And all of the chapters are the same. If you're taking Genki 1 in a class and you have book 2 assigned, you can still get book 3 and be able to follow along because all the sections are the same. With that said, some of the examples and the practice is a little bit different. So if you're getting homework from the book as opposed to the workbook, you may need to have book 2. So as an example of simplified English that I'm just a big fan of, they've greatly simplified, or rather improved, the writing, the English writing in the new Genki book. Here's an example. The original introduction sentences for question sentences, the second section of lesson 1, is it is very easy to form questions in Japanese. Basically, all you need to do is add ka at the end of a statement. Here's the new sentence. You can just add ka at the end of a statement and turn it into a question. Straight to the point, easy to understand, it's great. There's just too much wordiness in here that is unnecessary. They cut it all out, made it a simple statement sentence. I love it. There's lots of that in this book. Just for that alone, I mean, if you have a choice, if you're buying one or the other now, get the new one. It's easier to understand. If we go to the end of the section, you'll notice that we've got our culture notes. The culture notes are still almost identical. I didn't notice any differences, just maybe their placement is slightly different. We've also got our expression notes. I found that they are shorter. They've cut a lot out. I think there was probably too much information in there before. Some of it I thought was really good information, but I don't think it's a bad thing that they've cut down on it. There was just too much information in each chapter. There still is too much information in some of the chapters, but sort of cutting back on this, maybe they put it later in the book, I didn't find it yet. I think that was a good decision. Moving on to the exercises, you'll notice from page 1 right away that there's differences. The sentences are better. In this case, it's just completely different, but don't worry. We've got the same exercises later in the chapter. They're exactly the same. I think some of the sentences that we're using here and some of the example tables are simplified greatly. So you'll notice we've got the same people here. We've got Mary and Takeshi or whatever, but we've cut out some of the information so it's just not so overwhelming. This will be good for classwork, for homework. It's better. The sentences I think have been improved a bit, simplified in some situations, lengthened in others to help you have better Japanese that you can actually use. With that said, it's time to jump over to chapter 3. So one of the main things I wanted to know about Genki 3rd edition is chapter 3 better than the 2nd edition? Chapter 3 is literally one of the worst sections I've ever read in any Japanese textbook ever. It's on the first conjugation, the polite mas form in Japanese. And in book 2, it's horrendous. It's actually the reason I started teaching from Genki, because it's so bad and so many people use it that I felt like someone should explain it a little better. With the new edition, I was hoping they would have made some updates to it. So let's check that out. Looking at it, we can see that in the original, there's these big block paragraphs. And they're all terrible. They're almost impossible to understand. If we look over here in the new book, we can already see that there's less explanation paragraphs. This is good news. The better news is that they're also simpler, just like a lot of the English in the rest of the book, and much easier to understand. Let's just go over the first sentence. Here's a nice long sentence that's hard to understand. We've got, in this lesson, we learn about the dictionary forms, the present tense affirmative forms, and the present tense negative forms. Finished, right? In this one, we have verbs in Japanese conjugate or take various shapes. In this lesson, we learn 3 forms: the dictionary form, the present tense affirmative forms, and the present tense negative forms. There are 2 kinds of verbs that follow regular conjugation patterns, and an example of each below. So there's just a lot of unnecessary information there. They're cutting it out. With that said, they're still using the do, u, and irregular verb pattern. So do verbs, u verbs, irregular verbs. I still hate that. I still consider these u verbs and iru and edu verbs, or better yet, godan verbs and ichidan verbs. It's easier to understand that way because it gets really confusing when you call these u verbs, but there's actually do verbs included. Now, these do verbs are not included in the do verbs because they're actually iru and edu verbs. Now, you don't have to worry about that now. If you want to learn more about that, I did a stream all about lesson 3 that explained it very clearly. There's a link right over here. It's still way easier to understand in here than it was in the original book, so I think people will have a lot less trouble learning it just from the book. With that said, I still think the do, u, irregular verb decision will make people make a lot of mistakes, and I still think I'll have to teach it in my upcoming streams again, just so that people aren't too confused about it, because, I'm sorry, it is confusing. I just think it is a higher quality book. I think there's new vocabulary that's a little bit more modern. The main thing I was worried about was chapter 3. I think if chapter 3 is better, and it is, it's worth getting the 3rd edition. Jumping to the back of the book, where we learn about kanji and hiragana and whatnot, the very first thing I noticed is that when we hit our first page, we've got questions about hiragana and practice, but there is no hiragana chart. There's nowhere they teach it. Of course, in the front of the book, we have the hiragana, but I'm telling you, It's way easier to have it right here when I'm about to learn it, right in front of me, than it is to have to turn back to the front of the book every time I want to look up a hiragana. So that's great. It's just a little change, and I think it's an important one, and it shows that they were really trying to make as many little improvements as they could in this new edition. The exercises are all pretty much the same, pictures are all pretty much the same, but some of the sentences, there's some extra stuff. I think it's better organized. So we've got the same thing with katakana here. There's no chart. Here we've got the chart, so it's better. Moving on to the kanji lessons now, you will notice that there is no real changes. Obviously, beyond the color, everything is exactly the same. It's the same kanji, the same examples, the same format, so no updates there. One last thing to mention is that there is no CD in the new edition, but you can download all of the sounds from the Otonavi app from the Japan Times, so you can still get all the sound, but in a more modern way on your cell phone or probably on a website as well. There's also no advertisement for the other apps that Genki has, but I've heard great things about the Genki vocab cards, kanji cards, and conjugation cards on my Discord. Check out my Discord if you haven't already, because we talk about a lot of things about Genki and about Japanese learning in general, such things as good apps for learning Japanese. So make sure you get the Genki conjugation cards if you're having trouble with conjugation during Genki. So I've already streamed the entirety of the second edition of Genki, but because there's been so many changes, and because I actually came up with a new format back in lesson 10 of the second edition, I'm going to be starting over fresh with the third edition and streaming it live here on YouTube from probably a week or two from now. So please subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell so you know when I go live. So that's it. That's my before you buy review of the Genki textbook. What do you guys think? Do you think that the third edition is better than the second edition if you've already got it, or if you're just watching this? Are you going to pick up the third edition? If so, there's a link down in the description, just in case. If it's your first time here, my name's Andy. I teach and stream lessons from Genki, as well as create other grammar lessons and things like that. I do comedy and many other things here on Toki ni Andy. So if you want to get more of that, why don't you continue watching right here? And if you want to keep learning more Japanese with me and my friends here on Toki ni Andy, why don't you hit the subscribe button right over here. And I'll see you next time.